We're joined now in the studio by Douglas Kennedy. Douglas Kennedy is an internationally best-selling American novelist. He is the author of 11 novels, including Leaving the World and The Moment, and his books have been translated into over 20 languages. In 2007, he received the French decoration of Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, a prestigious French literary award. Before starting his career as a novelist with his debut, The Dead Heart, he was a successful journalist and playwright. Several of his books have been adapted into films, and his most recent novel, 5 Days, was published earlier this year. So, Douglas, it's a pleasure to have you in the studio. Thank you so much for coming.
I'm delighted to be in Seoul. Thank you.
Well, how are you?
I'm good. It's been wonderful. About 3 years ago, my international rights agent rang me up and said, sit down, I have some news. The Big Picture had been published here in Korea, and it turned into a sensation. One never sort of expects these sort of things. The book had been doing very well elsewhere, and it had been out at this point for 12 years. But it seemed to speak to something in the Korean experience.
Yes.
Even though it's a very American novel, and suddenly went through the roof. It sold over almost 400,000 copies here. And so suddenly I had a huge fan base here. And I was very interested to come out and explore it, and my publisher said, please do.
You've been several times, haven't you?
This is the first time.
Oh, really? This is your first... Oh, wow.
First time. So it's my first trip. And it's been fascinating. I'm a great city man, having been born and raised on a little island called Manhattan.
Yes.
And having lived in London, I also, before that, I lived in Dublin as a student and worked there for the first 8 years after university. And then also I still maintain residences in Paris and Berlin. So I'm very much what the French would call a citadin, a city boy. And Seoul strikes me as a very good place. I always look at a city and think, if I was told you're living here, would I be happy? And I think I'd be very happy.
So when did you arrive? How many days?
I arrived on Monday. Yes, with that sort of twisted geography flight from New York, where you leave and you arrive 2 days later, and it's a 14-hour time change and almost 15 hours in the air. But here I am, and feeling relatively fresh and very stimulated by my week here.
So what have you experienced since you've been in the city?
Besides, all my readers, which has been fantastic. I've gotten out. I've explored the city on foot. I like neighborhoods. I found a great jazz bar called Once in a Blue Moon.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yes, I basically have knocked around a few museums. I'm especially impressed by the the new Museum of Contemporary Art, which is superb, place, and also an architectural wonder. I went up to the DMZ, which was rather interesting. Years ago, when I was a journalist on the Sunday Times, I was offered a trip to Pyongyang, and unfortunately, something family-wise came up and had to cancel it. I think Seoul probably is a better option.
I think perhaps so, yes. So you mentioned the reception to your work here in Korea. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? What has the reception been like?
A couple of things have been very interesting for me. Booksellers and publishers around the world will tell you that the demographic is changing quite a bit, that basically it's women who buy books everywhere. And also that it's older people who buy books, older meaning kind of 35 plus, which still strikes me as pretty young.
Yes, I hope so.
I think so. Here, what has been extraordinary and incredibly pleasing is that I have a huge fan base of people who are in their 20s. And even younger.
Okay.
That's been the majority of people who've been out to see me and meet me. And I've been hearing things. The Big Picture, I think, because it's about a man who has been forced into a life he doesn't particularly want due to sort of kind of familial duty. And he's a lawyer, and he always wanted to be a photographer. And then he finds out that his wife is having an affair with a photographer. And he goes to see the man. I don't want to say what happens, but things go very wrong. It's a novel very much about breaking away from the identity you've been forced into and creating a new identity. And it clearly has spoken to something in the experience here. I think I don't like making sweeping generalizations, but if I can talk about a Korean experience and an American experience, I know this personally from the States because I ran away to Ireland and then the UK to get away from family pressure. There's a huge pressure there to actually be responsible, do what's expected of you, get the good job, especially if you've been well educated. You have a responsibility to do this. I think something in the big picture speaks to that experience here in Korea.
Right, and that's what broke through for you here, isn't it?
Yes. It broke through in a huge way, but there are another, there are another 10 novels, and 3 travel books. So suddenly people have been discovering everything else, and it's hugely gratifying.
And your new novel, let's get on to that, 5 Days, that's getting published quite soon, I believe, or?
It is now out here in Korea. It's been out since last week in Korean. It's been out in English in the UK with Random House and the US and Simon & Schuster since May. It's my 11th book. It's the 6th time I've written in the voice of a woman, which is something I'm clearly capable of doing, so I've been told anyway. And it's quite... on one level, it's a deceptively simple story, and yet I think there's a tremendous amount of kind of density to it. It's about a woman named Laura, who's the narrator. She's 42. She is a technology assistant in a radiography unit. So she basically runs scans on people all day. She spends her day looking at other people's cancers.
Right, the insides of people.
The insides of people and actually the mystery of mortality. In her own life, a different kind of cancer is metastasizing, which is a very common cancer called despair. She's in a marriage that has essentially flatlined. She is with a man whom she probably never should have been with, but kind of got together after a tragedy in her life. She has 2 children. She's a very devoted mother, one of whom's at university, the other of whom is about to leave. It's a small life. It's also a study of middle-class America, although it has a universality. And it's basically, her husband's out of work. There's her salary, which is $51,000 a year, which would be, times 1,000 in terms of won. So,
yes, right.
And it's not a huge amount of money for people to live on. It's a very, 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 shall we say, contained life. She's never traveled. She doesn't have a passport. But she goes to Boston for a weekend radiography conference and meets a man called Richard, who at first sight seems very dull and uninteresting and sells insurance. And he's in his 50s. And then she meets him again, and he asks her, would you like to have a drink with me? And something starts. And what happens after that? You have to read the novel.
It's a fascinating setup. You mentioned she has a very interesting career. She works in radiography. Why did you choose that particular?
Well, I was going in for a scan, something routine, I should add, 3 years ago at a moment when I was single. And I remember the woman who was prepping me for this scan. I was being knocked out for it. Was very attractive in her 40s, and I started flirting with her. Why? Well, she was attractive to sort of something I do. And 3, I think at the same time, I was nervous.
Yes.
And it's an anxious thing going in for a scan, even if you're being told this is simply routine. And I started thinking about the sort of person who does this kind of work. And also what might go on in her own life. I think the other thing, as several critics have pointed out, the book is sort of a radiography of an unhappy marriage, and also of what is essentially a midlife crisis. Although, it's not the sort of midlife crisis. Laura's not someone who's going out of her way looking for men or anything like that. On the contrary, she's quite quiet and responsible. But she's unhappy, and she's alone. As is Richard. And loneliness in a marriage, I can say this being divorced, is something that is just so difficult to bear. And so, in a way, I think what has been fascinating about the book is that everyone has said to me, whatever their age, it functions as a mirror, this novel. You read it, and you actually see a lot of your own life and your own dilemmas.
Oh, really?
Which pleases me no end.
Yes, right, I'm sure it does. Well, you mentioned there that it's also kind of an examination of middle-class America, and I know that you've talked before in the past about this idea that American novelists, regardless of the genre or what they're writing, they're always grappling with this idea of the American psyche. Do you think that comes through?
I think it's very true. It's interesting. I've lived, off and on for 13 years in France. Je parle la langue. It's my second language. I have 3. I speak German as well. And it was fascinating. French novelists after the war turned away from writing the big social novel, or even novels that look at the kind of state of the nation. I think British writers and American writers very frequently do this. I think even more so American writers. There are a lot of British novelists do as well. When you think of someone like Ian McEwan, for example, or to a degree, Amos, certainly someone, in the past, like Graham Greene, there was always sort of a sense of Britishness there. I think American novelists, even when you're not writing about the States, you're still writing about the States.
Oh, really?
It's a big, contradictory, schizophrenic society. I love my country. It also drives me insane. I lived away for 33 years. And eventually went back. And the reason I went back was because, quite simply, it was home. I still maintain a pied-à-terre in London and Paris, and that's no hardship. But I wanted to be back part of it, and back in the mix. It's my argument. Your country is like your family. It's the perpetual problem, but it's also your roots.
And that's what the new novel partly engages.
I think it does engage in that, but I think it also goes into something far more universal and far more complex, which is a question I have very frequently, which is, why do people remain in unhappy situations? That's very basic, but it's very common.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's hugely common. I've often said that the hardest question in life is 4 words. What do you want? What do you want? That's enormous. And very few people have the answer to that question. But in the case of Laura and Richard, they're both in marriages that have essentially died. They discover in each other a similar interest in books, in words, and they are very copacetic, to use that marvelous word. There's an ease there. This happens when you fall in love with somebody. I know this because I'm remarried. And this is a brief encounter over a couple of days. So it's not quotidian life. It's not the day-to-day. But there's a chance here. There's an opportunity. What do you do with this? And can you, if the possibility of happiness is there, actually grab it or not? And if you don't, why? So I think in that sense, the novel deals, if I may say so, with something very large and fundamental, which is the nature of happiness, and also why, in certain ways, we self-sabotage that.
Wow, that's very interesting, and those are all very interesting questions as well, and they touch on some of those universal values that I think you're talking about. And actually, in connection with that sort of universal idea, there's this wonderful quote that I read from you not so long ago, and you said that we read to discover that we're not alone. Can you perhaps explain a little bit or expand on what you mean by that?
Well, I think fundamentally, why do we read? I think, yes, of course, we read to be transported elsewhere. We read to be diverted. We read to be informed. But also, I think there is something very important, and this is something I've built into my fiction. My style is very accessible. I have, for example, in France, I've met cab drivers who love my books, and also professors at the Sorbonne or École Normale Supérieure, which is even better than the Sorbonne. I like the fact that intellectuals and concierges read me. But also, I think it's very important when you're writing in one way or another to grapple with what is basically referred to as the human condition. And also those large primal questions that we all grapple with and for which there are very few answers. So I think it's interesting. A couple of years ago I wrote a novel called Leaving the World, which among other things is about the death of a child, and a very tough book. Although that comes into it about halfway through. And I was approached by a woman in Angoulême, which is a small city in France, in central France. I was there on a book tour, and it was a big signing. There was a queue of about 300 people. And this woman came up to me, and she was in her 40s, and she burst into tears. And I sort of reached out for her hand and said, "Are you all right?" This is in French. And she said to me, "My only daughter I only fell pregnant once. My only daughter died of cancer 5 months ago at the age of 6. I'll never have a child again. It's completely destroyed my life. Yet I read your novel, Mr. Kennedy, and I realized I was not alone. And I said to her, Madam, you have validated my existence. I think it's very true. I mean, I think 5 days, everyone tells me that they see themselves in the book, and they see their fundamental dilemmas. And I don't have questions. I mean, I don't have answers to those. I have a lot of questions. There are plenty of pop psychologists or people who write in certain kinds of women magazines,
Yes.
you know, who will tell you, you know, how to solve the problems of your life. I think fundamentally, most problems in life are not very solvable. You kind of muddle through, but hopefully you do so in an interesting way and a positive way.
Wow, thank you very much. That's a great answer. I'd like to move on. Can you maybe tell me if you had any particular influences whilst writing 5 days? I noticed that you mentioned the phrase "a brief encounter." I don't know, were you deliberately or subconsciously?
Well, no. In fact, the David Lean film, everyone forgets that it was written by Noel Coward.
Ah, yes.
The David Lean film with Celia Johnson and Trevor Howard is a film I've always adored. And so there was that. That's an exceptionally English movie.
It is indeed,
I mean,
yes.
it's about as English a film as you could ever imagine, and works brilliantly. So there was certainly that. Graham Greene's The End of the Affair, even though it's not about a brief encounter, was certainly. I mean, the fact is, I think the ancient Greeks said there are 10 basic stories, and we all repeat them. I think also, you know, I was at a point in my own life when I was writing this, it was sort of 3 years after my divorce. And I had a tremendous amount of thoughts personally, and also sort of philosophically about why one stays in something which is not good. And you can provide all sorts of reasons: children, property, fear of the outside. And I wanted to sort of look at all that. But also, I did want to write a kind of contemporary love story that is not really a love story. It's more of, in the end, a kind of philosophical investigation into the nature of essentially choice. Choice is everything, as far as I'm concerned. People talk about destiny, you know, my destiny, or, you know, that it's the hand of God. I feel destiny is choice. And actually, you make your destiny through the choices you make. And, you know, for example, I came back to Dublin on a visit in 1977. I'd been there at Trinity. I came back from New York. I was stage managing off-Broadway. I came back for 2 weeks to see some friends at Trinity who were still there. I fell in with an old friend of mine who said, why don't we start a theater company? And I did. That changed my life. 18 months later, I was in charge of the Abbey Theatre's studio theater, the Peacock, and I started to write at night. Now, again, if I had not made that choice, my life would have probably been very different. And a life is created by choice. That's your destiny in a funny way. And a lot of times, you know, you do these kind of choices subconsciously, subliminally, and yet they have such a major impact. But say the choice is a larger one. Say you are in something unhappy, and here's the opportunity for happiness. Do you stay or do you go? That is also what the novel grapples with. Well, is this idea of choices, is this what informs the other love stories you've written? I know it's a genre. Well, I don't think I've written love stories, really. I mean, because... In fact, I don't think any of my novels could be called love stories. You wouldn't describe any of them? No. Okay. No. There's love, of course, but that's a part of human life. But I've never said I've written love stories. I think they're very different. Even The Pursuit of Happiness, which is about a love story, but it's also about McCarthyism and the role of women in 40s and 50s America. Love is part of them, but, you know, I think there has been some packaging techniques with the books which make them look that way, but, you know, they're not love stories. How do you feel about the film adaptations of your work? I know there's been a couple of films made from The Big Picture was adapted for the screen, as was The Woman in the Fifth. Yeah, and also The Dead Heart was made into a very bad Australian movie. Oh, really? I've often said that basically the cinema is like the casino.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I go to the casino. I take risks in my life, but not with money.
Yes.
Or not that kind of way with money. I think, essentially, you're sort of in a win-win situation when they make a movie of your film. They pay you. Sometimes it's not bad. If the film works, and I love the film of The Big Picture, which was a French movie with Romain Doris and Catherine Deneuve.
Yeah, fantastic actors.
And it's a really superb film. Thoughtful, intelligent, brilliantly made, and captures the spirit of the novel wonderfully. It's retransposed into France, so I like that very much. The film of The Woman in the Fifth, I wrote the original screenplay, which was rewritten by the Polish director, Paweł Pawlikowski. I didn't like his rewrite, but I sort of held back and let him get on with it, because it was, essentially, you see, that's the other thing. If you are the novelist, it's not your film, the director's king. Always. That's how it works. I then went to see the film in a rough cut, and I thought it was rubbish. And so I just very quietly took my name off of it. And when the film came out in 2011, I was just very quiet. I was polite about it. And I will say it again. It's a radical rethinking of my novel. The two actors are wonderful. You should see it and decide for yourself. And you can read between the lines.
All right.
It took almost 13 years between the publication of The Big Picture and the film of The Big Picture. And 3 or 4 people were bidding for it. Then there was something happening and it fell apart. This is the usual business with the film industry. I had someone kind of dead keen on 5 Days in Hollywood. He ran out of money. So it's just, it's not something I hold my breath about. If it comes along, great. And, if the film works, well, it'll, sell some more books. And if the film is a disaster, I have my novel. Win-win.
Yes. Well, I think that's almost all we have time for, I'm afraid, today. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, Mr. Kennedy. Thank you so much for coming into the studio today. I just have one final question for you today. Would you like to recommend a song for us?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I just saw the Coen brothers' new movie, Inside Llewellyn Davis, which is set in the milieu of 1960s folk, right at the beginning of the 60s in Greenwich Village, right near to where I grew up. I grew up on the edge of the East Village, actually. And I was being asked recently by a French journalist what was my favorite Dylan song, and without hesitation, I said my favorite Bob Dylan song is Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. I remember breaking up with a woman in Paris. This is kind of one of those post-divorce relationships you have, who was quite crazy. And I remember playing the song the night that I said it's over. And it's a great song about actually just walking away.
So there's a lot of memories attached to it for you.
Good memories in the sense that I walked away from something bad.
Okay, well, hopefully you don't have the same feeling as we leave the interview today. And as I said, thank you so much for coming in today. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. And if you're ever back in the country, please come back and visit us again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for joining me today. That's all I have prepared for this week's show. I'll be back next Saturday. Stay tuned for Out and About with Sue Park. I'm Barry Welsh, and I leave you now with Bob Dylan, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. This is Douglas Kennedy's song request.